Hello, hello, and welcome to this webinar, Show Me the Money, Show Me the Data, hosted jointly by the BPI and AIM. My name is Emma Pike. I'm a consultant working with BPI, and I've been quite involved in coordinating this work around the industry agreement on metadata. I'm going to hand over in a second to our main presenters today, who are Sylvia Montello, CEO of AIM, and Vicky Fry, who is the CIO of Vegas Group. So they're going to talk us through some slides. We're also going to take questions if we have time, and we're going to try to take those questions as we go through rather than all at the end. So if you have a question at any point, please just pop it into the Q&A box, and we will come to it if we can. If we can't get to your questions, then they're going to be really useful anyway, because they will help us to shape session 2 of this program, where we're going to be looking more at kind of best practice in terms of how to implement this metadata agreement. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this session. And as I say, any questions, just pop them in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Sylvia Montello, CEO of AIM, to introduce the presentation. Sylvia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Emma. So if we look at the second slide, this will give us some historical context as to why we are at this position where we're talking about metadata and a metadata code, and also give a little bit of historic context around metadata and the music industry. So during lockdown, when other revenue sources weren't available to many artists because their live shows had disappeared, and really there was a laser focus around the revenues that were coming in for creators, artists and composers from streaming, there was this real sort of in-depth look at how the streaming revenues and the royalties that were paid through were actually being collected. And there was a lot of debate around whether it was fair and whether it was accurate, and whether the creators were actually getting the revenues and royalties that they were due. As part of that, there was a DCMS select committee put together to publish the report of an inquiry into the economics of music streaming, which had happened in government. Obviously, when you look at music streaming and there is a report looking into whether this area is actually as accurate and on point as it should be, there has to be some outcome from that, and there had to be an industry response really to looking into that inquiry. So once the government had published the responses, led by the International Property Office, the IPO, it targeted a couple of key work streams that were being launched, led by the CMA and the IPO. This led to work streams around 2 expert industry groups. One of them was targeted with improving metadata practices, and the other was targeted with enhancing transparency across the music industry through a code of practice. So fast forward a little bit into last year, the 2 working groups started meeting on a regular basis with a cross-industry contact group of senior industry members, really digging into these 2 areas to look at what the industry outcomes should be and how the industry could work together. So these working groups involved a metadata working group, which is the one that we're focusing on today, a transparency working group, which was really looking at transparency of metadata and contracts between labels and artists. And there's a contact group, which we'll show on a future slide, that really explains who was involved in pulling these working groups together and really advising and feeding in. Later on in May this year, the output of the first of these streams, which is the Metadata Technical Working Group, has published the UK Industry Agreement on Music Streaming Metadata. So that's a little bit of the background around what has been happening in the last couple of years to get us to this point where we have this industry agreement on music streaming metadata, which we'll be talking you through today. Scrolling back even further and really looking at metadata in the music industry, and why we are at this point that we are now with metadata that isn't complete, maybe isn't accurate. The standards of metadata perhaps haven't been robustly agreed across the various different stakeholders and across the supply chain. We probably need to think back to the days pre-streaming and pre-download. When I started in the industry, well, almost 35 years ago, metadata was handled via what we called label copy. And that was really something that was put together to put the credits of that particular album and the particular recordings largely for physical product. The record companies and the record labels were largely responsible for pulling together the data on the recordings. But because of the way in which the industry has worked, the publishing and songwriter and composer information sometimes didn't travel through to the record labels. So that label copy wasn't necessarily complete. It would have lots of gaps in it. Coupled with this, often the label copy was given to the interns or the very junior people coming into the record labels because it wasn't a very exciting and sexy job to do. So the A&R teams or the marketing teams really didn't want to spend their time putting together label copy and researching the information. So unfortunately, it was left to the more junior people who perhaps didn't have the guidelines and the standards set for them to actually make sure that the information was correct, the information had what we needed in order to make sure that everybody was receiving the correct royalties. Once we started to move from the physical landscape into the download landscape and then into the streaming landscape, it became ever clearer that the quality of the metadata really was quite poor, but the record labels were still only really sending the metadata through the distributors to the digital platforms and really just focusing on the mandatory data that they needed for the recordings. So where there was publishing information, composer and contributor information, it could be included, but it wasn't necessary for the record labels to have to provide that. So if there were gaps, they went ahead. Metadata has been arguably one of the biggest problem child of the music industry for several decades now. And it's one of the most important things that we can focus on now to make sure that it's accurate, it's complete, because that is the way in which your songwriters, your contributors, your performers, your recording artists and rights holders really will stand to get the accurate royalties from the streaming platforms. This is such a big project that there's this initiative in the UK, but also several other initiatives around the globe to make sure that metadata is finally being treated with the importance that it should always have been treated with, not something that's a boring sidebar, but something that's actually integral to the supply chain and the value chain of digital music and streaming. Hopefully that's a decent sort of overview and background. And I think now we can start to move over to talking about the nitty-gritty, which Vicky is going to be leading on. So over to you, Vicky.
Hello, everybody. As Emma mentioned, I'm Vicky Fry. I'm the CIO at Beggars Group, and I was one of the label representatives on the metadata working group. So I'd like to talk you through the outcomes of that. But actually, before we get into this, I think there are a couple of polls we wanted to run just to get a better sense of who is here and what everyone's current level of knowledge is. Aha, I can see it on the screen now. So if you wouldn't mind answering this first question, round one, which of the following best describes you or your organization? All right, okay, on to the second question then. Which of the following identifiers are you familiar with? We'll be covering these in the session. Yeah, right, so lots of indie labels, some distributors, aggregators, major label DIY artists. Okay, great, good range of people on the call today. And the second poll, yes, I think it's coming back on the Q&A. The second poll is slightly flawed in that you can only select one answer, not multiple. So not surprising that's come back as everybody's familiar with the ISRC, a few answers on ISWC. Okay, not to worry. Thank you everybody for doing that. Let's move on. So just first of all, starting out with what was the remit of the Metadata Technical Working Group? This was set by the IPO very broadly to look at data, technology, interoperability in education. And this is their language on the slide here. But in simple language, this really boiled down to trying to understand where the biggest issues lie, both across the recorded music and the publishing sectors, to better understand what data elements are critical to different players in the value chain in order for them to effectively play their role, and therefore for the overall music value chain to work, and then understanding what the barriers currently are to the flow of this data and where improvements were needed. And that led to commitments from different parties to try and improve the current situation. So then just a quick look at who was on the groups. And you can see here, Metadata Working Group on the left-hand side actually had a pretty wide representation from across the UK music industry, reporting up to a contact group mostly consisting of senior people from trade associations representing their different constituencies. But I'd like to start with a diagram of the end-to-end data and payment flows. Essentially, all the parties shown here were in the scope of this, at least for the UK market. And it's based on a diagram the Labour reps presented to the working group last year. If you can bear with me, I'd like to spend a few minutes walking through this, as it underpins pretty much all the points that come after. So if we start from the left-hand side, what it's trying to show you is the myriad of flows from parties that labels and distributors work with in the creation of new content. Whether that's the contracted artists that labels have signed a record deal with, their artist manager, the featured artists they're collaborating with, studio producers, studio personnel, session musicians, who of course also work with DIY artists, shown at the bottom left. And of course these roles can be blurred. The artist might also be a producer, for example. One of the points the labels made to the working group is that we need to dispel the myth, if there is one, that the label is automatically the oracle when it comes to recording metadata. In reality, I think, as most of us know, the creative process is usually a chaotic rather than a well-ordered one that involves multiple parties who may be in different physical locations and working at different times. And it's evolving rapidly. For many labels, the norm is no longer a series of large studio sessions that label A&R are closely involved with. It's quite possible the label is not aware the sessions are taking place at all, and these sessions can be informal bedroom sessions. But anyway, in terms of collation of metadata, you can see here the record company taking in these inputs, and that's the light blue arrows, often with the artist manager acting as the label's first point of contact, and with the studio producer generally responsible for collating metadata about each session, as well as the assets themselves. It's probably worth saying very quickly that there's a distinction between information about sessions and the metadata about the final mix, including which contributions made it onto the final mix. The inputs to the mixing process are likely to include a wide range of stems for different components, and artists might take snippets from many different sessions. The final mix can also include samples, which introduce further challenges, as this is third-party data that has to come into the label. But it's information about the final mix and the mastered recording of that final mix that's stored in the label's label copy systems. At the bottom, you see the DIY market equivalent, where the artist submits their metadata and assets to the aggregator. In this scenario, the artist doesn't necessarily have professional report for collating metadata, but logically the process mirrors the label flow. And from the label or aggregator, recordings are communicated on to digital services. Some labels go direct to streaming services, but many will use a digital distribution partner. And the good news is that there is a very well-established industry standard to communicate releases to DSPs, DDEC-ERN, and every recording that's released into the supply chain must have a unique identifier, the ISRC, that's assigned by the label or aggregator. DSPs then report their usage back to labels and aggregators. This is generally via their own proprietary formats rather than industry standard formats. But nevertheless, it generally works well in that the content used is specified with reliable identifiers. It means that labels and aggregators can match DSP usage automatically. So DSP, by which I mean digital service provider or streaming service, to identify the right parties to pay, and payments then flow through, whether that's an ongoing royalties basis or one-off fee basis, with a frequency that also varies, but with limited payment lags. And artists and their managers are often provided they always provide with statements, but also analytics, often via online portals. So that's the recorded music side of the industry. On the right-hand side, in the green corner, we have the publishing sector flows. So in other words, the flows from creators or songwriters. These depend on whether the creator's signed to a music publisher or not. If they're signed to a publisher, they're registered with song details, which include the title, creator details, and song splits with their publisher. And it's kind of worth pointing out that works are very often co-written by many creators, multiple creators who could be represented by different publishers. So the publisher often controls a percentage share of the overall work. They then register these details with their CMO, which is their collective management organization, also called societies, or SPV. So SPV, the special purpose vehicle, that's a nod to the fact that some publishers have pan-European licenses, so they're not necessarily represented by a single CMO per country. A complicated world that, but I don't want to get sidelined into. A key difference, though, on this side is that publishers don't assign ISWCs, or at least traditionally they didn't assign ISWCs. This has traditionally been the responsibility of the society network. This did change, actually, in 2020 with CSAC's launch of their ISWC allocation service, which means that publishers can now get access to an ISWC allocated within 24 hours, provided they meet all the data requirements. I think in 2022, this was used by around 22 publishers. So it's gaining traction. Another key difference in all of this is timing. The publishing side tends to work more slowly than the recording side. So it's quite possible that the recording's already up on the music service before the work registrations actually come in. Publishers try to identify the songwriters by their unique identifier, which is the IPI number, and they have limited access to the CSAC's database to facilitate this. If the songwriter isn't represented by a music publisher, then they have to register their works directly with their society, their CMO. So, for example, that could be the PRS online portal. Right now, the streaming service typically doesn't get assigned to these works until after the recording's been streamed, as I've just said. But what they will do is send a report detailing the number of plays each recording has received at the end of the month. These usage reports then get matched by CMOs against their works databases, and they send in a claim report for the works they think are theirs. And today, this is often the point at which the link between a recording and a work is created, so an ISRC to ISWC link. Provided the CMO's claim doesn't conflict with other parties, the funds will then flow from the service to the CMO and then onto the creator and publisher. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the data flows. But what are the issues? And that's a good question. I mean, I would say the early sessions of that working group were really about trying to establish exactly where the biggest issues are. And the labels on that group gave their perspective that whilst the flows on the recorded music side aren't perfect, and there's always work to be done, we shouldn't overlook what currently works. And here's a list of things that we felt were broadly working. So gathering contribution credits. I mean, speaking for beggars, I can certainly say we take our role with metadata collation very seriously indeed. So that's names and roles of the contributors to recordings. Assignment of ISRCs. It's obviously extremely helpful that recordings cannot be released into the supply chain without an ISRC. The use of DDEX-ERN as the standard to deliver releases to streaming services works well, and so does DSP usage. So this is often via proprietary formats, but nevertheless, the content is specified with reliable identifiers, which means it's matchable. And as I said previously, that payments do typically flow back with limited payment lags. What are the issues then? So what became clear was that the biggest issues with data flows are on the more complex publishing side of the industry, with the central issue that songwriters are often paid slowly, and the time frame that was quoted was 6 months to 2 years, and sometimes not paid at all due to poor or missing metadata. And I've tried to summarize the key issues that came out of the process. And this top one's important. the fact that music services don't have the work details until after the recording has been streamed. What they have is the information that they've received from the record label or aggregator. So in other words, the writer names and roles, but they don't have authoritative information coming from the publishing side, typically. Second up, there is currently no single place to look to find a definitive view of which recordings link to which works. So what are the works for a given recording? What is the work for a given recording? So you'll hear a lot of talk about ISRC to ISWC links and trying to establish the authority of those links. In practice, each society does this, and they will have their own view of those links. And those links are not open, typically. The third up is the fact that on the publishing side of the industry, key identifiers are not completely open. In other words, they're not accessible by all parties in the value chain. And the ones that are causing problems are IPI numbers. So these are the numbers that identify songwriters on a musical work. And the IPI database is essentially closed to the CMO network, although publishers have a limited view, so they can assign numbers to their own writers. Writers themselves will see their number if they go into their society portal. And ISWCs, so ISWCs, there's currently no kind of public view of them, aside from the CSAT website, which allows manual lookups on a one-to-one basis, but there's nothing that would help a programmatic access to ISWCs. And I think that it's worth saying that because it's more complex to get an ISWC than it is an ISRC, the result is that many works don't have one. It requires all the parties to be identified in order to get one. So just moving down the list then, I think actually this fourth one is so crucial that it starts at the beginning, that creators, so the people who genuinely originate this information, are not necessarily aware of the importance of metadata. And so they don't always provide it, they don't even necessarily know their own identifiers, or they can be slow to do so. So it can be difficult for that data to come into the value chain at the beginning. Second of all, so cost, inefficiency and inaccuracy, I think this is alluding to the fact that the matching between recordings and works happens in many places. So there's duplicative cost in doing that. And then finally, this point about each party in the chain passing on the information they receive. So there is a sense that not everybody captures the metadata that comes into them. And in some cases, they might change it or just drop it. So it may have come into the label. It doesn't necessarily get displayed on the DSP service. It doesn't necessarily appear in the reports that go out to licensors, for example. All of these issues make it difficult to get songwriters paid accurately and quickly. So that's a bit of an overview of the issues. And before we go on to kind of what came out of the agreement, Sylvia, did you want to talk us through some numbers to kind of give a sense of the scale of this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Vicky. So we have collated a number of industry stats here just to show what we're dealing with in terms of the number of new ISRCs created and uploaded to streaming services every year and what that balance looks like. So the data would show that roughly 100,000 recordings are distributed every day to the streaming services. So that's 100,000 ISRCs that are uploaded to streaming services. The vast majority of those are uploaded not through the three major labels, but through the independent sector. There's some data that's been collated by Impala, who are the European trade organization for the independent sector, that outlines roughly 80% of new recordings and new releases are uploaded from the independent sector. The growth of this has been exponential over the past 5 or 6 years in particular. So we're looking at now 196 million ISRCs for audio and video recordings. and almost half of those were created since the beginning of 2020. That's an enormous amount of data and content. On average, there are 4.4 writers in 2021 across each of the top 100 songs. Now, depending on the genre, that could be anything from a single writer up to between 15 and 20 writers for a hip hop track, for example, where you tend to have lots more collaboration and lots more input on the songwriting side. So you can imagine there the complexity of data is enormous. Looking at the new ISRCs created each year, the chart there on the right hand side shows just how much that's grown since 2018. So you can see there the total number of those global ISRCs for audio and video recordings. There has been some debate around the data when it comes to things like redeliveries of existing recordings and metadata updates for those as to whether they count as a new delivery. And we do know that when a particular catalogue is moved from one distributor to another distributor, there have been many occasions where erroneously a new ISRC code has been allocated to a recording because of that switch of distribution. We were going back to how the metadata standards and knowledge around ISRCs were really not understood very well, and in some places are still not understood very well. But there has definitely been a duplication of ISRC code allocation across the industry for several years, and this is sort of adding to this overwhelming problem that we're seeing now in terms of the numbers of ISRCs on the streaming platforms and just the volume of content that we're looking at delivered every day. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here is a streaming pyramid that was put together in 2022, again looking at data provided by Luminate, who were previously known as Nielsen, and are the sort of key data provider based in the US, but looking at global data. One of the most shocking stats that have been discussed in 2022 were that almost a quarter of ISRCs that had been delivered to platform had 0 streams that year, and 42% had 10 or less streams in that year globally. So that's, again, this is showing the enormous amount of content, the enormous amount of metadata that is being delivered, and looking at actually the proportion of that is dormant or not being consumed at all. The pyramid there shows really the numbers by billions or millions or thousands of streams. And you can see there, this vast majority there, the 67.1 million in the purple bottom of the pyramid is 0 to 10 streams across the services. So that's another piece of this incredibly complicated metadata puzzle and incredibly complicated, voluminous metadata issue that both the labels, the distributors, the publishers, and the services are having to look at. And the data and trends would show that that number is likely to increase as the number of DIY and self-releasing artists and the volume coming out of those sectors also increases over time. Back to you, Vicky.
Thank you, Sylvia. Right, so let's get on to the metadata agreement itself. And this slide lays out the ambition within the agreement. So the ambition, the high-level ambition, is to get to a complete data set, which is what this first bullet is saying. To make sure that metadata is complete. It comes from an authoritative source and available to those who need it when they need it, so that the data and therefore the monies flow through as they need to. The signatories to the agreement committed to working over the next 2 years to improve the quality and timeliness, particularly around song and songwriter, work and songwriter metadata. To get to with the ideal being that complete work and songwriter data is provided to streaming service in a similar time frame to recording metadata, and that works and songwriters are consistently credited. Well, that's the ambition, but what are the practical steps that people are taking to get there? And actually, the agreement boils down to 3 key practical steps. The first of those was to recognise that there is a core data set, and the signatories have agreed to take steps to get that core data set up on streaming services. The second is for all parties in the value chain to follow and promote good practice. And finally, the third action was to establish more detailed expert groups, 2 of them on education and data, to try to drive forward concrete improvements during this 2-year period.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, Vicky, that would be good to touch on now. So our first question is around multiple ISRCs. So songs are used to multiple ISWCs due to multiple writers. Question is there a preferred ISRC deduplication process like there is for ISWCs when there are duplicates?
And I think, hi Scott. I think the short answer to that is there isn't a formal process of deduplicating ISRCs in the way that you see within the ISWC database. I mean, the way it ought to work is that the commissioning party should be assigning the ISRC, and where the record label is playing the role of exclusive licensee or acquiring catalogue, they need to source in the ISRC from the party that they're acquiring from or licensing from. And I think that, I mean, that is definitely a weakness in the ISRC standard, that it's possible to have multiple ISRCs because of parties assigning their own.
And also because of, again, the misunderstanding around an ISRC being a code that sits with a recording for life and shouldn't be altered when a catalogue is moved from one label to another or from one distributor to another. The other complication around the deduping of ISRCs relates to the royalty pay through. So sometimes it's not as simple as looking at 2 ISRCs, deciding that this one is the more appropriate one, and basically ditching the other one, because if the other one actually has royalty payments that are being assigned to it through the value chain, then there needs to be a slightly more complicated linkage of those 2 to make sure that royalties are still getting to where they need to get to across 2 or sometimes even multiple ISRCs. So this is indeed one of the challenging areas of the industry. There are some third-party music tech companies that are working to assist with the deduping, but it is something that needs very careful attention in terms of how to actually roll up multiple ISRCs when they've been allocated to the same recording. We have a couple of other questions as well. I'm not sure whether we can answer this one. Do you have any insights into the number of ISWCs or original songs available commercially in those 196 million recordings? Vicky, do you have a sense of that?
I don't have a stat to hand. I mean, that's something perhaps we could come back to you with in the next webinar.
Absolutely. And I think another couple of questions we'll probably be touching on a little bit later in terms of when a master's remastered, should it have an ISRC? I think, Vicky, you'll probably be speaking to that.
Yes, I would expect a remaster to have a separate ISRC. It's a separate recording going into the supply chain.
And are we also looking at who are the current signatories of the metadata?
Yeah, my bad actually. I should have included a slide with the current signatories. Again, we can come back with that list, but it's fair to say that the trade bodies have signed the agreement on behalf of their members.
And I believe a couple of the platforms and some distributors as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Let's move on. So let's look at part 1 of this. So part 1 is about the core data set. So the idea here is to identify the set of data elements that enable recordings and their underlying works to be unambiguously identified as streaming services including the contributors, whether those contributors are performers, studio producer personnel roles, or writers. And I think it's worth just saying that it's the responsibility of multiple parties in the value chain on both the recorded music and the publishing sides to get this data right. And this is, just to be clear, this is static data. It's just about identifying unambiguously what the recording and the work is. It's not about rights, it's not about splits. It's not about data that changes over time, in other words. So here on the recording side, we're saying that the core data set is the title and subtitle, the recording artist, performer and studio producer / personnel names and roles. So names and roles are the contributors to that recording, and the recording ID, so in other words, the ISRC. There's a note on the right-hand side about identifiers, and we'll come on to talk about IPN numbers and ISNI identifiers. So there is an encouragement to use these identifiers where possible. On the work side, the core data is the title and subtitle, the writer names and roles, the writer identifiers, and again, we'll come on to look at IPI numbers and ISNIs, and the work ID or ISWC. With those constraints that we already talked about, that ISWCs and IPIs aren't necessarily available. Right, so I thought it might be helpful just to go through an example recording, just to try and bring these data elements a little bit to life. So this is an example, Grimes with Beggars at the point this was released, and this is Venus Fly that came out in 2015. And on the right-hand side, you can see the credits as they're currently shown on Spotify. But if I go forward, so let's first of all look at what this looks like on the recording side. So the title and subtitle are easy enough, Venus Fly. The recording artist, well, in this case, there are two. There's a main artist, which is Grimes, and a featured artist, which is Janelle Monáe. And I've just indeed actually communicate that as main artist and featured artist. I thought on the right-hand side, it might be interesting just to pull in their identifiers. So Grimes is an interesting case because Grimes as a stage name has an ISNI, and Claire Boucher, who is Grimes, has a very strong preference that she's known as Grimes on digital services. So in this case, whilst Claire Boucher does have a separate ISNI of her own, we would choose the ISNI for Grimes. And Janelle Monáe has a separate ISNI. As you can see, it's a 16-digit number. Then we go on to the performer and studio producer personnel names and roles. So in this case, we've got Grimes on guitar, programmer, violin, and vocals. Janelle Monáe Robinson on vocals. And then Grimes is producer and Mark Stent as mixer. So because these are individuals, they are people as opposed to artists, they get an IPN number. So this is the performer number that is assigned by their performer societies, such as PPL, when they join. And this is at the granularity of legal name rather than a name, a stage name. So Grimes, whether she is known as Claire Boucher or Grimes, has one IPN number. Janelle Robinson is actually quite an interesting case because you could argue that she should have two separate ISNIs, one for Janelle Monáe as her stage name and one for Janelle Robinson as her legal name. I think it's fair to say that some of these nuances have not yet been completely ironed out. But she would have one IPN number. And Mark Stent again would have his own IPN number and his own ISNI. And here you can see the ISRC for this recording right at the bottom. So possibly labouring the point a bit, but these identifiers, the International Performer Number, or IPN, is the number that performers get assigned via their MLC, music licensing companies such as PPL. There is a shared database that MLCs use, which is called the IPD database, that manages the assignment and storage of this information, but performers should be able to find it if they log into their MLC's portal. Now, the intent is that labels should be able to integrate with this database directly, and Universal do currently do so. But whilst I think it's a fairly slow process to get that rolled out to labels. But in the meantime, individual MLCs can perhaps help labels their label members anyway, identify individual IPN numbers. Just given a link here to some information on that from BPI. And then we go on to ISNI. So ISNI is a separate thing. It's not owned by the music industry. It's an open ISO standard that's used often. Actually, it started out being used by libraries, but also by publishers, rights management organizations. And it is kind of two ways you can be involved in ISNI. One is as a registration agency or as a member. If you're a registration agency, you can apply to get an ISNI created. And I've just given the names of some prominent organizations that are currently registration agencies. So YouTube, Tidal, Warner, and Sound Exchange are amongst that list. I think it's fair to say that YouTube, Tidal, and Deezer are really keen to get ISNIs, ingrained in the music industry. But any organisation that's a member of ISNI can programmatically get access to the API and can retrieve existing ISNIs. So that Apple and Spotify are currently members, to my knowledge. Yes. So I'm just looking at the question. There's quite an interesting question about do you have a view on the formatting conventions of the stores and how that affects the DDEX? For example, if Edith Fly was a single, the label would need to submit the featuring artist as a second primary artist to ensure it's displayed in the releases section of the Spotify artist page, rather than just the appeasal section. The person who said that's a really, really good issue. So just to go back to this, I'm stating this like it's really easy. Main artist Grimes, featured artist Janelle Monáe. In practice, it's not that easy because different stores have different levels of support for featured artists in particular. And it can be very, I think actually labels find ourselves sometimes in a fairly impossible position where what one store needs is actually what another store will actively discourage. And we certainly see that with some of the differences between Apple's Style Guide and Spotify Style Guide. On that question, I think there's a lot to be done there around just laying out the different requirements of stores and the different levels of support that stores have for this information. And I kind of hope that we'll get onto it in this second data expert group that's now started up. But I digress. To go back to the example, so we just took a look at ISNIs, and this point that some top tier DSPs are actively encouraging labels to provide ISNIs with their release registrations. I mentioned some fairly big names there. Right, well, let's look at the work side. So here we have a work titled Venus Fly. The writers were Grimes and Janelle Robinson. Grimes as composer-author and Janelle Robinson as author. And here we see the IPI numbers. So the corresponding IPI number for Claire Boucher is given here. So her ISNI, because we would send, in our case, we would want to send this as Grimes as the writer, we'd use the Grimes ISNI, but the IPI number is, again, it's on the legal person. Broadly, does support multiple name numbers for different pseudonyms, but in this case, it's Claire Boucher. And then you'll see Janelle Robinson will have a separate IPI name number. And here we see the work I do at ISWC with its different convention to ISRC. And so then this takes us to the writer identifier. So IPI is interested party information, which is the number writers get assigned by their collective management organization. So that's, for example, PRS. And as I mentioned before, there's a shared database called the IPI database, which manages the assignment and storage of this information. Writers can be assigned multiple IP name numbers, which are linked to a single base number per natural person. Now, label access to IP name numbers is pretty limited at the moment. The one resource that is available is the open ISWCnet work search. So in the context, you can search for work on title and creator surname, and it will pull back the IP name numbers. Just showing you these two here. ISWC is the unique identifier for musical work, and as I mentioned before, it's a higher bar to get an ISWC in the sense that the requirement is that all the creators of the work must be listed, identified by IPI number. They each need a correct roll code, and there can't be any unnotified shares. again, label access to these is currently limited. So you can do these manual lookups on ISWCnet, as I mentioned before. And I've got a screenshot here. Now that kind of wraps up part one. This is the core data set.
Thanks.
So the obligation is between us, the parties in the value chain, are seeking to make sure this is available on music services.
Right.
Shall I go on to part two?
Just before we move on to part two, I was conscious that there was a question as well around the thoughts on blockchain to facilitate transparent metadata across multiple parties. I've been working on the supply chain and value chain side of the business for about more than 15 years. Blockchain has come up on a number of occasions as being a solution around this. However, really the issues aren't around the technology basis necessarily in the platform. The issues still rest on having accurate, agreed data that goes into the blockchain. With any other methodology of having a shared database that is transparent across the industry, it's only ever as good as the quality of the data that goes in. So really focusing on the quality and the accuracy of that metadata rather than focusing on the technological platform that will be hosting that is really what we're looking at doing here. I know from some of the third parties that are looking at creating deduplicated, updated, accurate databases, they're actually leaning more towards the use of machine learning and AI for actually deduplicating, correcting and updating data rather than on blockchain technology at this point. This isn't to dismiss it entirely, but it is something that has come up over several years. There have been a number of parties that have set up a blockchain solution for the industry. And unfortunately, it's fallen down because it's predicated on so many other factors of industry agreement and industry understanding. So perhaps this will be something that will come up again in future as a solution, but it is something that's been investigated for the last 5 to 10 years at least.
Thanks, Sylvia. There's another question that's come up to say, is there an ambition that labels are able to deliver ISWCs to DSPs for their releases and have these ISWCs available to the label when they're setting new releases up in their system for initial delivery to DSPs, or is this not practical, at least in the short to mid-term? That question was an absolutely key discussion, I would say, throughout the metadata working group last year. And there were, I think, going into that process, some voices in the room that were very keen to try to move to a position where not only are labels encouraged to provide ISWCs to services, but in fact, a sort of what we felt was an untenable position, an unfeasible position of saying labels must provide ISWCs in order for their releases to go live at the DSP. I mean, we'll come on to this a bit when we go through the code of good practice. The code of good practice is that labels, when we come on to that bit of this table, are encouraged. We're actually taking an obligation to encourage the flow of this information into us and to make sure we pass it on when we have it. Honestly, in the short to medium term, it isn't feasible to say that labels will have an authoritative ISWC. But there's certainly initiatives that are trying to improve that situation, and we'll come on to looking at a couple of those at the end of these slides. The second question is it's a detailed question about ISWCs and what happens if one of the contributors has no IPI. I'm going to make sure I get my facts right and respond to that offline, I think. Why are there so many methods of performer IDs? Why do we have all these different numbers? Somebody's asked. They serve a different purpose, and they're managed by they're under different governance. So IPN numbers are really for performers, and they're used by performer societies or label and performer societies such as PPL to identify their membership and to make sure their membership get paid. Whereas IPI is used by a different set of organisations. It's the equivalent set of societies, but on the writers' side. So that's PRS rather than PPL. So they have a different, approach to assigning numbers to their own membership. Of course, one person, as we just saw with Grimes, can be both a writer and a performer, and in which case they would have both numbers. ISNI is a separate thing. ISNI is a public identifier that hasn't come out of the music industry, and it's much broader than the music industry. Any persona can have an ISNI. Donald Duck can have an ISNI. And the reason it's come into play is I think it's accessible and it's open, and so therefore it can address some of the issues that some of the parties in the value chain have with getting access to IPI or IPN numbers. It's also worth saying that IPI and IPN don't between them cover all the possible contributors. So, for example, studio personnel are not performers, so they don't get an IPN number, but they would get an ISNI. So ISNI is also very helpful at kind of covering some gaps. Hope that helped. Right, so let's get on to part 2 then, which is the code of good practice. So this is laying out some standards that all parties in the value chain should try to follow in their use of music metadata. And signatories to the agreement are effectively aiming to implement this as soon as they are able to. So we start out with this is really the left-hand, well, this is the far left-hand side and far right-hand side of the diagram I showed you earlier. It's the originators, songwriters and recording artists. And this is really about making sure that their data, their identifiers, come into the process right at the beginning. So we're saying songwriters should look to record and provide accurate information relating to their copyright works as close as they can to the point of creation. So this means their full given names, their roles, and where they can, identifiers and rights ownership information. So for example, that would be the song split. Recording artists, it's a mirroring point really. Should record and provide accurate information about their performances at the point of the recording. So here it's their names, their roles, and if they do know their IPN number and or any ISNIs associated with them, they should make those available. And artist managers, really, they where they're representing artists and songwriters, they should take reasonable steps to make sure they have this core data, and they can then pass that on to releasing parties and publishers. So this is really about saying the whole chain flows much more smoothly if the information comes in at source. And again, I would say that performers and songwriters who are members of societies can find out their own numbers by looking at their society online portal. So then we go on to, I kind of guess we're going on sort of through links in the chain really. Artist managers and publishers should ensure that songwriters agree their relative contributions, their respective contributions and song splits as early as possible. So let's get the data right and clear and agreed at the start. And yeah, the point about the next one down, publishers, CMOs and SPVs, it's about saying, let's get the ISWC and IPO promoted as it is the gold standard in terms of how works and songwriters should be identified. Because these are the identifiers that are used in CMO databases and publisher databases. So in terms of getting people paid, these identifiers are very helpful. So there's an action here about making these identifiers more accessible, easier to issue, easier to access to a wide range of parties. And then we come on to publishers. So the first point is about, I mentioned earlier in the slides that CSAC have launched an ISWC assignment system to publishers. And so this first point is that as many publishers as can use that system as possible, the better. Because this means the ISWC gets stamped at the start of the process. There's an onus on publishers to get their works registered as soon as possible to the recording release date. and also to ensure their registration is as complete as possible. So just going down to the bottom of this slide, it's about getting these identifiers into the data flows, either directly or by their society, and making sure that where there are enrichments to that data, so for example, where they have submitted a work registration and the CMO then hands back an ISWC or related ISRCs, that they then ingest those. So there's a kind of continuous improvement element to publisher databases. I've got some more questions on the board.
Yes, the top question there is around whether the MMF, so the Music Managers Forum, are doing similar training with their members to help music managers understand their responsibilities in with this data. It's a very good question. We will double check on that, but I imagine that all of the trade associations that have been involved with this metadata good practice will be putting on similar training, and it's very important that they do so. But we will check and come back to you on that.
The next question is, how would I find out my ISNI? And is that just one number, IPN and IPI, pointing to the same ISNI? There is a, I did put a link, so just if I go back, there is an open search that you can, so there's a link here that we can send through. So you can search for your name on ISNI. I mean, I will say at the moment, ISNI coverage is patchy. I think there's work to do to get it kind of fully onboarded. So some of the sources to the ISNI database are kind of public charts information or music brains information. You know, so it may be that not everyone will currently have an ISNI, is what I'm trying to say. Can you access the slides afterwards? Is another question. I'd say that's fine with me. Right, where were we? Publishers. So let's go on to CMOs. So they are committing to improving the speed and automation of work registration. Essentially to take steps to enable ISRCs to be issued and made available before as close as possible to recording release date. So you see this point repeatedly about trying to reduce that lag between recording information and works information, and ensuring that they do pass all enrichments back to publishers. So allowing for that continuous improvement over time. Studio producers. I think I mentioned when I went through the flows that studio producers are generally the party that takes on a responsibility for delivery of the sessions, whether that's the assets or the metadata. So we're saying here that the studio producers should seek to provide the core data set for each recording to the releasing party. So we use the term here, by the way, releasing party, generically to mean labels or aggregators or distributors. And then, so the parties, I think this is trying to get at the parties that are dealing with this data in the first instance. Studio producers, artist managers, and label and publisher A&R are kind of at the beginning of those chains, should cooperate and make best efforts to assemble and provide core data to releasing parties. So it's basically, again, looking at how we get that data in so it can be passed on to music streaming services. And then we get on to the interesting bit, which is releasing parties. So what are the commitments that releasing parties have taken on? You'll see there are 4 of these. The first is to make sure that we capture all the recording data for which we are authoritative. And the list you see here is the data elements on the recording side. Title, subtitle, artist, ISRCs, names, roles, and where they're available, identifiers. So the second point is about making sure, basically capturing it, but then also, of course, passing it on. And the pass-through of information includes information that labels would not consider themselves authoritative for. But if that information has come through to the label, we should seek to pass it on because it could be useful down the chain. So that's work, songwriter, performer information, identifiers. But also, yeah, this point about actively encouraging. trying to get this information in the door. Ensuring that core metadata fields are available to users. So this third bullet is actually more geared, I think, towards distributors or aggregators, and it's making sure that where, for example, there might be an aggregator portal or user interface that's being used to capture core metadata, that portal supports all of these fields, that it's possible for people to enter the core data set so that they can pass it on. And then finally, the final point is a contractual one. It's saying we should aim to make sure that contracts with studio producers have a clause to make sure that contributors are asked to identify themselves, so that there is a contractual obligation to deliver this data into the releasing party. I'm hoping all that is fairly clear. So sorry, a question from Scott, or maybe just a point from Scott to make. Even with song info being registered early, without a link to an ISRC, there is no current way to get a songwriter credited as a service timeline issue. So the link is a critical item here. And I think that's fair. I mean, the songwriter credits you saw earlier up when we looked at that Grimes example will be credits that have come through from the label. So where we're providing our ERN release notification with a list of writer names and roles.
Just another point on that as well. Scott's absolutely right. The linkage between an ISRC and an ISWC, again, is something that's being looked at within the sort of parties that are trying to establish more complete metadata. And again, there are those sort of third-party music and tech companies that have been spending a lot of time and energy actually looking at how to accurately link the ISRCs to an ISWC. Obviously, a lot of that work is being done retrospectively for works and recordings that already exist. But going forward, that would be the gold standard, is actually to provide that information linked at the point where the releasing party is actually making the recording available. It's also to Vicky's point about metadata portals that the releasing parties have, certainly for labels and distributors, making sure that actually the core metadata fields are in their portals or in their metadata systems is going to be a point of development for some. Some will already have all of the fields available, possibly not populated correctly. Others will need to potentially do some development work to make sure that any of the extra fields around performers, contributors and publishers that they don't have in their system setup are included. And the same will apply for the digital services as well. So any of the certainly the larger online sort of global digital platforms will now need to make sure that they not only can have the data delivered to them, but that they have fields of data at their back end to put into, so that they can actually utilize that for their royalty calculations. That's something else that's being discussed very heavily as part of this code of good practice. It's very important that actually the DSPs are able to take in all of the data provided and be able to then interpret it, analyze it, and turn it into something that is a viable royalty output.
Which actually is a nice segue, Sylvia, to this slide, which is about the service providers. And it's actually, I think, making the points. Someone is sorry about that. Yeah, but it's actually making the points you just made very well, which is what we need the music services to do. And the first of those is to make sure they ingest all the metadata provided to them by releasing parties. The second is for them to look at how to incentivize getting this data provided. So it's great that we have representation from the service providers in the data expert group. I know that a couple of them are looking at the star guides and looking at ways they can encourage these data elements within their star guides. The third point is about making sure credits are accurately displayed. So to make sure when you go to look at a music service, you can actually see unambiguously who the contributors were, whether in fact they are on the recorded side or the writer side. And the fourth one is really important because it isn't just about taking that data in, as Sylvia's just said. It's also about having the correct integrations internally, that information then flows through to their royalties reporting, so that they then report out that data to rights holders. So, for example, the writer information coming in from their sources, flowing through, and then appearing in their usage reports on the way out.
We have another question around whether Spotify, Apple, etc. ever auto-generate ISNI, and if not, how are they matching artists correctly to artist profiles where there are multiple instances of the same artist name on the DSP?
I don't believe Spotify and Apple are generating ISNIs. I think on this, I was just trying to make the distinction earlier between the difference between ISNI registration agency and an ISNI member. I think they're members rather than agencies, meaning that they are retrieving ISNIs, but not able to create them. I think for those two services in particular, it's probably worth saying that they both very much like labels to provide their IDs. So the Apple Artist ID and the Spotify URI. So we do tend to provide, speaking for beggars, we provide those as well. Spotify also like labels to provide a proprietary ID. So ISNI isn't the whole answer. Particularly for the big services, they also have their own IDs that they ask us to provide for artists rather than for contributors. And that's actually generally what helps direct content to the right artist profile. So there's the next point here is more of a comment, I think, from somebody saying that PROs are happy to accept incomplete registrations, but may not pay out royalties if registrations aren't complete. I can't comment on that, to be honest.
I can comment to an extent on that. It has been identified that there is there's still a lack of consistency in terms of mandatory data fields across the PRO structure. So many of the PROs and CMOs that have their own internal databases, they actually have different core sets of data that they require to be provided to them. This is the topic of a lot of conversation at the moment, and the willingness to move to a place where there is at least an agreed set of basic data that can work across a number of the global PROs to help with this particular problem. Some of the core data sets, depending on where the PRO is located, can actually be very brief. And then on a territory by territory basis, some require mandatory fields that other territories do not because of their own territorial legislations. So that is another sort of complex area to look into. And I think for the second session, we can take this comment away and actually look at maybe giving a little bit more colour around that in terms of the registrations for the PROs.
And there's a question to say, is it possible to tell us a bit more about DDEX? I mean, at a very high level, DDEX stands for Digital Data Exchange, and it is actually an incredibly helpful set of data interchange standards that apply across multiple. In fact, to be honest, actually across the whole life cycle. There is a DDEX standard that provides guidance as to how information should be given. The levels of implementation vary across the different standards, but for example, ERN is the electronic release notification, and that's used by all labels to send their new releases to digital services. There is a related DDEX standard, DSR, which is used for sales reporting. So we talk about usage reporting from DSPs to author CMOs, that's using DDEX DSR. There's also some really interesting developments in DDEX, and I just wanted to mention actually DDEX RIN, which is recording information notification, I think. Actually, I might have that wrong. But the RIN standard is about looking at how we can better specify information coming out of sessions from producers and into labels. So the idea is that in future, labels could receive, rather than the current, I think, fairly manual process of emails or spreadsheets to get that information from the producer, artist manager, artist, and into label A&R, to move to an electronic interchange, so where there is essentially a document that describes the data coming out of the session. And there are some really interesting companies looking at technologies that could be used within sessions that would help with this, to try to, again, with the aim of trying to get that information at source at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, it's worth just adding to that in terms of DDEX and its adoption, as Vicky said, the adoption and execution of DDEX standards has varied historically across the recorded music industry. The larger distributors are often in a position to be able to adopt the latest version of DDEX, whereas some of the smaller or territorial distributors that don't have those systems may still not be using DDEX or using an up-to-date version of DDEX, or they may still have other methodologies for being able to provide information. So again, it's another area where more consistent and up-to-date adoption of the DDEX standards would certainly be very beneficial to moving us towards getting to a point of quality, complete metadata across the piece. So from major label repertoire all the way through to self-releasing and DIY artist repertoire.
And there's a question about, can we clarify best practice for labels to set up featured and guest performers, as there seems to be a lot of inconsistency and misunderstanding how the metadata should work for that. So for example, some add featured artists into the artist name and some into the title, and some don't include it at all, or it's bracketed in the track title. This can impact attribution on the service, certainly. It's a bit of a topic in its own right, though, and I think it's a bit of a rabbit hole for us to get into now. I think that the nub of it, though, just very briefly, is that not every DSP supports the featured artist role. And so for specific services, if you send artist information, as DDEX recommends that you do, which is as separate display artists, so you'd have artist 1 as your main artist, artist 2 as your featured artist. It's not a given that that featured artist will always be attributed on the service, depending on the service. And I think that there is actually a need to do a kind of full mapping exercise. This is unfortunately why labels can find themselves having to undertake workarounds if they really need that, to make sure that artist gets credited on a particular store. But I should say the DDEX standard is quite clear on it. And in general, we should seek to follow the DDEX standard, which is not to include featured artists in the title. It's actually to list them out as an artist with a featured artist role.
There are some further complications or implications around that as well, depending on what the nature of the agreement is between a featured artist and a guest artist, or between two featured artists, as to how the information should be displayed on the DSPs. As well as some limitations on the number of featured artists that a recording can have before it's actually deemed to be a various artists compiled track. So there are lots of moving parts around this, but it's a really very good question. And further clarity on that is something else to help map out. We'll go on later to highlight a couple of resources. One of which is a metadata resource specifically for dance and electronic music, which is where you know the sort of featured and guests and compound artists is particularly prevalent. So we'll come on and touch on that a little bit later on.
Yeah, it might actually be interesting in the next webinar to walk through perhaps a more complicated example than the one I did just now. And Scott raised the observation that it's also complicated by the fact that CMOs also have different rules for titles and featured artists in work registrations.
Yes, the lack of consistency in data standards around how the CMOs operate is it's been a topic of conversation for a fair few years now, will continue to be, because that's another very important piece of this overall puzzle. is actually getting to a point of agreed standards and agreed sharing of those standards across the CMOs and PROs, rather than them sort of operating in a slightly more siloed way in terms of their own particular needs and their own particular standards.
There's a question in the chat about, could providers be penalised in financial terms for late or non-delivery of crucial information that's available to them? So, I mean, at the moment, all releasing parties need to provide the mandatory data elements as per, as they're currently set out in D.CRN. Artist title, ISRC, and I think it'd be interesting actually for us to understand a bit more about the different validations that aggregators apply. But certainly some distributors and aggregators will insist on there being at least one contribution on that recording in order for it to go out into the value into the to music services. As I mentioned before, there's also, I think, likely to be incentivizations by music services that data comes to them, in as complete a way as possible. But at the moment, I'm not aware of sort of financial penalties other than just the ability to get the release up on the service, meeting the services requirements.
Yeah, that's the penalty that is in place at the moment, and as the digital services decide on further fields to become mandatory for delivery, so let's just sort of scroll back a little bit, even as far as sort of 6 or 7 years ago, mandatory information to be provided to a couple of the bigger services didn't include publisher composer information. It was much more around the recording artists. So over time, the services do actually extend which of the core data fields become mandatory. And if metadata is provided to them that doesn't have correct information in those mandatory fields, it will be pushed back and it won't be released on platform. Going forward, will there be financial penalties? This isn't something that I believe is being discussed at the moment, and it's certainly not part of the code of good practice to actually put in financial penalties. So this is more about good practice rather than a sort of mandatory code where there are going to be penalties. Can we foresee that changing in the future? Possibly, but there's no real talk of that at this point in time.
Right, so that kind of wraps up the second part, which was about the code of good practice. Which leaves us with the third part, which is what happens next? What is the ongoing process? And as you can see here, there are further groups. There are now an expert working group on data, which is chaired by Scott Farrant, and an expert working group on education, which is led jointly, I believe, by Ellie Condon of PRS and Dave Humphries of the IPO. So the data group is up and running at the moment, and its remit is defined as quite a part of it is to look at KPIs. Let's look at let's measure this. Let's measure the data at different points in the data chain, so that we can, first of all, get a better sense of where data is getting lost, where the current issues really lie, but also to start to be very quantitative in terms of what the targets are. And as part of that, and to achieve that, to do a kind of more detailed mapping exercise to look at existing workflows, so that we can, and this is essentially looking at different use cases. So let's look at the different ways that recordings come into being, the different scenarios. So that could be, a brand new recording of a brand new work. It could be a cover, and so on. It could be a remix. So let's look at those different ways that creations occur, to see what the specific challenges are, and to understand how best to approach this issue of how we create these authoritative links between works and recordings. And I should say that, that one of the goals of this is to better understand where there are missing data flows and where existing data flows need to change, rather than us just working within the status quo. And then on the right-hand side, the education group, looking at where there are gaps in education resources. I mean, we've talked about this in this call, that the need for greater awareness, greater education, making sure that performers and creators understand how best to maximize their chances of getting accurately remunerated. And so this is looking at how we address those gaps, how we work with existing resources and existing initiatives to make that happen.
Added to that as well, we know that the IPO, as part of their data steering group, are very keen to interview labels and releasing parties from across different parts of the industry, so different size labels, different genres as well, some of which have their own peculiarities in terms of their metadata structure. And they have come to us at AIM to ask if there would be any other labels or rights holders that would be keen to be interviewed as part of that information gathering and the different use cases that they're looking at the moment. So this is something that, if anyone out there hasn't been involved in this and would like to be, then do get in touch with us about that so that we can then propose your label, your rights holder, as part of the sort of data steering group and part of those interviews for gathering more of the use cases and really building that picture of where are we now, so that can inform where do we need to get to.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I believe that just takes us to that's the end of part 3. So really, we've walked through the metadata agreement now, and this slide was just to talk very briefly about what other initiatives are happening out there and what resources you might want to look at. So as you'll have seen, there are a bunch of kind of links as we've gone through these slides, as well as these ones here. So there are a couple of initiatives that are worth mentioning, and they're both around access to ISWCs and IPI numbers. So the first is called Project Nexus, and this is an initiative that's being run by the PRS. And what it's trying to do, or what it's seeking to do, is to make an API available, also a portal, to parties who have an interest in it. So labels, but also it could be artist managers, it could be aggregators, to be able to retrieve existing links that they have made. So to be able to query this API with an ISRC to return information about the work. So that would include the ISWC, the writers and their API numbers. So this is helpful particularly for catalog, where that link has already been made. And it's about sort of just getting that information in as many places as possible, I think is what they're thinking. The second is a proof of concept. So Project Nexus has a live release at the moment. This is all very new. The second initiative is at a proof of concept stage. I think it's an earlier stage of its life, but it's to look at the possibility of getting ISWCs assigned earlier in the process. So this could potentially be a way for labels to call an API to get a provisional ISWC that would at least mean that there is an identifier at the start of the process. I think it's kind of watch the space on that one to see how that develops. And then you'll see here some resources. This music metadata style guide, I think I found it useful. It's a neutral one rather than coming from a particular service. It was done with DDEX, so it's a useful point to look at. And Sylvia's very helpfully provided a more specialized metadata guide for dance and electronic. Hope that will be of use to you guys. And that actually brings us to the end of the slides. I think we've taken the questions as we've gone, so I don't think there are any more questions at this point.
Well, yeah, and we're also right at the very end of our hour and a half. So I think just suffice to say thank you very, very much indeed to Sylvia and Vicky for an incredibly informative session. I hope everybody got a lot out of it. It was great to see so many of you attend, and also to get your great questions. So as I mentioned at the start, this has been the first of a two-part webinar. So we are planning to host a second session. We haven't decided on a date for that yet, but the idea is that whereas today was all about presenting what the metadata agreement is all about and what label and distributor obligations and commitments are under that agreement, the next session will be much more about hearing from specific companies, whether they are a major label, an indie label, a streaming service, a distributor, about the practical steps that they are putting in place in order to comply with this metadata agreement. So I encourage everybody to look out for announcements about session 2 and to join us again when we hold that session. Thank you again to Vicky and Sylvia, and I wish everybody a very, very good day. Thanks. Bye for now.